Hi, my name is Alys Weinbaum, and I'm a professor at the University of Washington here in Seattle. And I teach a variety of things: feminist theory, critical race theory, African American literature, transatlantic literature, and theories of modernity. And all of my work has centered around reproductive politics and the racial politics of reproductive politics. And so, with this current book that we're talking about today, which I can hold up for you because I actually have it right here, and I probably should have put it on my shelf, but it's called The Afterlife of Reproductive Slavery, Biocapitalism, and Black Feminism's Philosophy of History. Um, in this book, what I'm trying to do is explore the ways in which the long 400-year history of Atlantic slavery impacts contemporary reproductive cultures and politics. And that, in America often gets narrowed down to abortion politics. And of course, that's very important in the wake of the overturning of Roe v. Wade by the Dobbs decision in the recent Supreme Court ruling. But in my work, I'm actually interested in reproductive cultures and politics far more broadly than that. I'm interested in the way in which we as a reproduce ourselves, reproduce the human species, and the ways in which women's bodies are recruited into that process in ways that are often dehumanizing and are often deeply racialized. And so in this book, I try and set up a connection between that long history of racial slavery and the contemporary moment, which I call biocapitalism. And the reason I call it biocapitalism, that's a kind of fancy word for a form of capitalism that doesn't just exploit workers, but in a very particular way exploits the human body and its biological processes. So sometimes that could be about extracting stem cells, which come from umbilical cords. So that is actually a reproductive market. It could be about gestational surrogacy, which is one of the things that I really focus on. It could be about genome sequencing, DNA sequencing, and the information that's gleaned from that and often patented. It could be about the sale of organs and blood and other biological commodities. So all of that is biocapitalism. But what I'm saying is that the biocapitalist world that we live in, which is one face of capitalism, is at its very core is the reproductive body, and that body is being exploited in ways that are really only seen previously in the context of chattel slavery. And by that, I'm not trying to say that what's happening now is the same as what was happening during slavery. It's definitely not the same. It's been recalibrated and morphed in all kinds of complex and interesting ways. But our capacity to imagine extracting resources from women's biological reproductive processes and bodies, our capacity to imagine that and materialize it in the way in which we do reproduction today, that capacity was thought up, brewed up conceptually in the crucible of slavery. And that is because in slavery, the history of which most Americans, unfortunately, are woefully ignorant, um, you know, enslaved women's bodies were used to produce slaves. And that was very carefully orchestrated. And after 1807, which is the closure of the Atlantic slave trade and the opening up of the interstate trade, the only way to create fresh slaves for the market was by creating an economy based on slave breeding. And that, of course, sanctioned the sexual abuse of enslaved women by both white men and Black men. And it allowed for the use of those bodies as the source of commodities that could be sold on the market, and in fact were sold on the market. So once the slave trade closed in 1807, all new slaves that powered the American economy until the outbreak of the Civil War in 1865 were born and came out of the wombs of enslaved women. So that that connection is what interests me, and the question is, how do we explore that connection between the present and the past? So let me just say a few things about what's happening in the present, in particular around surrogacy. It's not that surrogacy is a huge market, although it is a multi-billion-dollar market, which is something that most people don't realize. And the American surrogate market is the largest surrogate market in the world. And women of color all over the world are recruited into surrogate labor, as are both white women and women of color in the United States. But surrogacy is important not just because of the amount of money it generates. It's important because of the way it works, which is that a woman is contracted into a situation where she gives over the child that she reproduces, whether or not she wants to at the time of birth, to those who have contracted for her reproductive labor and for the transfer of that product. And the precedent for that, as Black feminists began to point out when the practice began in the late 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s, that practice is predicated on slavery. The antecedent for it, the conceptual and material antecedent for it, is slavery. And as that practice has expanded, and alongside all the other forms of exploitation that characterize the biocapitalist economy, I think that surrogacy gives us a window onto the centrality of reproductive exploitation to the current reproductive economy, because surrogacy is a process that makes it so plain, and it makes it so transparent. And especially when we begin to look at how surrogates are treated in places where the women that surrogate are mostly very poor women who surrogate. It's a very constrained choice, let us say, if it is a choice at all, because they feel that it's the best way they have to get by and to help their families get by. That form of labor, how different is that ultimately from enslavement? There are important differences that we can discuss, and I'm not trying to create an analogy. I'm trying to help us understand where the idea to run capitalism the way that we're currently running it came from. And my belief is that it comes out of the history of slavery. And my belief is that by reading Black feminist texts, particularly texts that treat the history of slavery either through fiction or non-fictional means, Black feminist work, some by activists, people like Angela Davis, some by fiction writers like Toni Morrison or Octavia Butler, that these kinds of texts give us a way to conceptualize this very difficult set of ideas that I'm trying to advance, and that we need to bring forward the insight of those Black feminist works. And that is why I make the argument in my book that Black feminism actually constitutes a philosophy of history. And what that philosophy of history is they don't call it a philosophy of history. I'm calling it a philosophy of history. That what that philosophy of history is it's a way of thinking about the relationship of the slave past to the present, that understands the slave past always has an afterlife. It's always present with us in the way we think, in the way that we interact, and in the way that we organize the forms of capitalism that we use to make our lives. So let me stop there and ask if there's questions that might bring out my argument in ways that are useful for you all.
Well, the first question I have is, I'd like to back up a little bit and and kind of look closer at what you mean by the slave motherhood and how the womb becomes not an economic space, as it were. So, I mean, we understand that the enslaved woman has an enslaved child by law. But I think what you're talking about is a little bit more nuanced and a little bit more insidious, if it were, because I think your thesis is slavery is fundamentally and foundationally reproductive. And outside of what we think of as the field work or the owning of another human being, it becomes a philosophical location within the body. And that economic extension is, I think, something we could talk more about.
Yeah. So that that idea is an idea that I come to based on my sort of many years of reading the work of feminist historians of slavery, who have basically advanced the argument over time, slowly but surely developing it, that slavery is a reproductive enterprise. And one of my closest collaborators, a historian at New York University named Jennifer Morgan, has written, one of the most important books on this question. And she and I continue to work together. We're actually doing a book together right now called Reproductive Racial Capitalism, which makes the argument about the centrality of the exploitation of women's racialized reproductive labor to the workings of all forms of capitalism, including slavery. But Jennifer has also done some really amazing work on what is called partus sequitur ventrum. And partus sequitur ventrum is the Latin word. It comes out of Roman law, but it was adopted beginning in the 17th century in the treatment of slaves. It was actually in place before, but it gets canonized into slave law as a sort of way of organizing it in the 17th century. And what partus sequitur ventrum ensures, what it means in Latin, is that which comes forth follows the womb. And it ensures that any child born to an enslaved woman will itself be enslaved. And what it does is it transforms that reproductive body of the enslaved woman, and indeed the sexual body, because she, of course, needs to become pregnant. So it's the experience of heterosexual sex, conception, gestation, and parturition, or giving birth, that are all part of the reproductive process. And that process really turns her into the reproductive engine of slavery. And that the reproductive body is actually being engineered by the system of slavery for profit. And that intensifies over time, thus the importance of 1807. And the complexity of that is that, this is a question that I'm continuing to write about and work on. So I've done subsequent work on this since the book, and my arguments have continued to evolve. But my argument about that is that it's actually the enslaved woman's participation in that reproductive process of creating more slaves that retrospectively or retroactively transforms her into an object, a piece of property, and also labels her as Black. Because of course we know that not all slave women looked Black phenotypically. Many were very, very light-skinned. And we're not talking about the reality of Blackness. We're talking about the way in which the attribution of Blackness to an enslaved person became the mark of her enslavement. And I believe that that participation in the reproductive process is both a racializing process, of racializing participation, and a dehumanizing participation. And that twinned process of racialization and dehumanization which is an exploitation of reproductivity, of the woman's reproductive capacity and her sexual capacity. That and it's not sexual for the woman, it's sexual for the person impregnating her, right? That production of the woman's body as a source of commodities, and as an object that can be used in this way is just so deep. And a lot of theorists have and historians have thought about this in ways that are just quite profound. And some of them have, mostly Black feminist writers, but not all. Some of them have really argued that what happens in that process is a stripping away of the possibility of kinship, because of course what goes on there is that the enslaved woman isn't allowed to be a mother to her child. She might feel herself to be a mother, but she can't legally be recognized as the mother. And that is because from the moment of birth, that child can be disposed of with impunity. It can be sold away, it can be destroyed. All kinds of things can happen to the enslaved child, over which the maternal source of that piece of property has no control. And so that creation of both the child's kinlessness and the mother's kinlessness is one of the things that happens as a consequence of the
I think we froze here a second.
back.
Okay. Yeah, now we're back. All right, sorry about that.
Where was I when we froze, do you think?
The woman's you were talking basically the moment of kinship where
Yeah. Yeah, so the way in which that right to kinship is destroyed. And there's some very important theorists of slavery. There's a very important sociologist named Orlando Patterson who does a study called Slavery and Social Death, which is a comparative study of 66 societies, slave societies, over the course of human history. And he tries to find the common denominator, what makes all of these slave societies similar and what makes them different. Of course, what makes slavery in the Atlantic world different is that it's predicated on racialization and Blackness. But what's common to all forms of slavery is that they require what he calls natal alienation, which is the destruction of kinlessness, which is soul destroying and is a way of beating down the enslaved person and their progeny. And they require what he calls social death, which is the positioning of the enslaved in the world in a way in which life can often feel like a living death. And it's certainly a death in relationship to one's control over one's capacity to socialize with others, including one's family. So those ideas are all ones that I'm saying persist in the afterlife of reproductive slavery. And that concept, the afterlife of slavery, has been very forcefully developed in many domains. I mean, in some ways, the Black Lives Matter movement is a theorization of the afterlife of slavery through the logic of policing in our world, and the critique of the prison industrial complex is a critique of the afterlife of slavery and the way in which the principles of incarceration were brewed up in the crucible of slavery. But for feminist scholars and for my work, what's really important about the afterlife of slavery is what I would call the afterlife of reproductive slavery. That one of the centerpieces of enslavement, which is not often thought about or discussed, that is perpetuated across time in very complex ways, even as it's transformed and adjusted, recalibrated to fit the current moment, is that exploitation of women's reproductive capacity and its racialization.
Well, and you also see how that then kind of transfers into surrogacy, right? Where you have this breaking of kinship based on genetic performance, meaning, or biological performance, where another woman will carry a baby for a couple. And that female reproductive biology then becomes kinless in that it is solely working as an engine of capital, reproductive capital, right? And I'd love for you to kind of talk about Johnson and Calvert, and that you spend some time in the book unpacking that court case and what it meant for the surrogate, but also the couple, and what the court kind of found about not only whiteness but genetic entitlement.
Yeah. So the Johnson versus Calvert case is decided in 1990. So we're already talking, 33 years ago. And that is a very famous US surrogacy case in which a Black woman, a former military woman, bears a child for a couple under contract. And the child that she is gestating in her womb is not genetically related to her. She is what's called a gestational surrogate. So it's comprised of genetic materials that don't come from her body. The egg is not hers. And she realizes during the course of her gestation of this child that she doesn't think she wants to give it up. And that she would prefer to become the mother of this child. And what ultimately happens when she begins to make this preference known is that a court case ensues, and the judgment in this case is, of course, on the side of those who have contracted her labor, and she is stripped of any maternal relationship to that child that comes forth, and it is given over into the hands of the couple who contracted with her for her labor. And that really becomes the norm after the Johnson v. Calvert decision. So what we see over time, although it starts quite early on in the mid 1980s, is that surrogates who in the process of gestating the child come to the decision that they actually don't want to stay with the relationship of simply turning over the child to the contracting parties, they have routinely been ruled against. And that happened first in the famous Baby M case. And that was not a gestational surrogate. So, that was a woman, Mary Beth Whitehead, a white woman whose egg had been inseminated through artificial insemination by the contracting father's sperm. And she had a genetic relationship to the child and was not allowed to keep the child. Conversely, there have been a number of cases that are really distressing, in which women, mostly in India, but also in Thailand and in Nepal and elsewhere, have given birth to children that are somehow deemed to be less than prize-winning, specimens, and they have some kind of disability. And the contracting parents have refused to adopt the child. So what we're really looking at is that, intensive reduction of the female body to its reproductive function, and the stripping away of any capacity of the woman who creates the child to make a decision about the child. Perhaps in our current moment, in which we've overturned the Roe v. Wade decision that guaranteed women's right to determine whether they took a pregnancy to term or not, it shouldn't surprise us that women are not allowed to decide what to do with their children. But this is all of a piece, of course. And I think that we're in a world in which the increasing reproductive control over the female body is being invaded by the interests of capitalism, and in particular by biocapitalism and racial capitalism.
Well, and it's that racial piece that I'd like to talk about next, because I think the capitalism and the reconfiguration of the female body is, we've covered pretty well. But there's also, in addition to patriarchy and kind of the exclusion of the male from this conversation by the male's choice, I believe, because it's a power dynamic, there's also a racial continuance where there's a class function which becomes racialized and breeder. And that whole ideology starts to spin on white supremacy again, and patriarchy again, and capitalism again. But it taking what would have been the slave racialization and updating it for today's market, if you will. So if you could talk about how this whole conversation is actually racialized, and how, and I think Davis and talking about the Moynihan report is probably the location for it, but that idea of like, how are Black women once again being recoded as racialized machines of breeding, and how that not only damns them, but also, creates a whole other ideology on top of the ideology. You know where I'm going, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the most complicated arguments in my book, and I have continued, as I said, to work on this one, and there's new iterations of it that I think deepen it somewhat. But I actually make the argument that yes, of course, a woman of color's body or a Black woman's body, if she is the surrogate, is deeply racialized by this process and can be exploited because it's being racialized. I mean, the exploitation and the racialization are inseparable. Capitalism has always worked this way. That the concept of racial capitalism is encapsulates the idea that capitalism actually can't function without producing a racist idea of some kind of laborer that is deserves to be hyper exploited. And so, capitalism has always functioned this way. Slave racial capitalism functioned this way. Contemporary capitalism functions this way. Thus, the outsourcing of the most difficult and laborious forms of labor, the most toxic forms of labor, to people of color in the global South. But what I'm saying is that it really doesn't matter whether the surrogate is a Black woman or a woman of color, for her to be racialized by the process of engaging in surrogacy, because I'm saying that tethering of dehumanization to Blackness, that is the history of 400 years of slavery, and that has been forwarded in time in a very complicated way, so that anybody that engages in the commercialization, the commodification of reproductive labor and its products is tarred with the brush of dehumanizing racialization. And that means that any surrogate is going to have the court rule against her, because the needs of capitalism are such that to be a surrogate is to inhabit a racialized domain of hyper-exploitation, which has its roots in the history of chattel slavery in the Americas and the Caribbean. And so I give a fancy name to this in my scholarship. I call this the sublation of race in the context of racial capitalism and biocapitalism, in the context of surrogacy, for example. Sublation is a word that comes out of Marxism. It's a complicated word, but most people don't realize that sublation means both, retention and erasure at the same time. And what I'm interested in is the ways in which certain kinds of racial logics are at once retained and at the same time disappeared or disavowed or negated or evaporated, even though they're still going on. So we can imagine that slavery is a thing of the past when it's still present because of the way that anti-Black racism continues to function in our culture, and yet is continually being denied as continuing to function in our culture. And so that is the same thing happens in relation to the reproductive body of women that engage in surrogacy. But in fact, any woman or any person, in fact, whose body is being exploited by contemporary capitalist modes of invasion of the living tissue itself in order to extract it and to turn it into a commodity, whether that be people that are forced into so-called organ donation, which is really an organ market or an organ sale, and people who are involved in surrogacy or stem cells, or one of the biggest markets now is in the extraction of eggs around the globe. And increasingly, women that are used as the source of eggs are European or Eastern European. So a lot of people in the former Soviet bloc are women are egg vendors for the contemporary surrogacy market, because what is desired there in the racist script of perfected reproduction demanded by a consumerist capitalist economy powered by the desire of white infertile couples and even people of color that want to have light-skinned babies, is that there's a premium being put on white eggs. And so what we get is a global market in eggs, which puts the price tag on white eggs as important. Now, that's kind of complicated because there's so few Black egg donors, or so few Black egg vendors, that sometimes those eggs can have a very high price tag attached to them because of their rarity. But that's a kind of strange fetishizing spin-off of the reproductive market that is a white supremacist market.
And this whole conversation we're having paints a very dire and sexual dystopia. And I think if we want to talk about Morrison's Beloved, I think that book encapsulates a lot of the themes we're talking about in a closed system of racialized biocapitalism that is predominantly reproductive. And what response does a woman have in a world where the characters in Beloved exist, which is slavery, or also bringing it into the present day? We're working towards a sexual dystopia again with, as you said, the Roe v. Wade and the ability for society to say what women can and cannot do with their sexual reproduction and sexual health. So I think maybe if we can end on that, unpacking where we are in this landscape.
Yeah, of course, right now on reproductive dystopias. And the book that I'm writing right now is about reproductive dystopias, and it's a continuation of this previous book. In fact, the book is part of a trilogy. So my first book is on the relationship between race and nation in the context of modern nationalism. This book that we're talking about today is about the relationship between race and reproduction and slavery. And my new book is about thinking about why we can only imagine the relationship between reproduction and the future in such negative ways, and sort of mining that. But Beloved is an amazing novel written by Toni Morrison that I'm hoping many of the people listening will have at least read or know about. If you haven't read it, I can't encourage you more to read it. It is simply, for me, one of my favorite books. Um, and it is a beautiful retelling of a real historical case of a woman named Margaret Garner, who was enslaved, had children, and attempted to escape from slavery with her children, which was an unusual choice. A lot of women that went fugitive were unable to bring their children with them and escaped on their own if they did indeed take that risk. But Garner attempted to flee from slavery with her children, and she was apprehended because of the fugitive slave law by when she crossed into free territory. She was apprehended by slave catchers, and rather than allow her children to be remanded back into slavery, she attempted to murder them and was successful in murdering one of her children. At the time the case happened, it became a sort of cause célèbre for the abolitionist movement, because people felt that, she was revealing the atrocity and the violence of slavery. So Morrison finds this little scrap in a newspaper in the 1970s and uses it as the basis for Beloved, the fiction. And she reimagines the story of Margaret Garner from the perspective of the mother. And she puts that mother, who has made it into freedom, but has killed one of her children. She puts that mother into the aftermath of slavery, so into the Reconstruction period. And she imagines what her life was like living with her actions. And the way she imagines it is by bringing her murdered daughter back to life in the form of, some would say a ghost, some would say a fantasy, some would say it's a real woman. It depends how you read the novel. It's a novel. That's the beauty of it. And Setha, the name of the character in the novel, interacts with this daughter, and through her interactions with her, renegotiates the violence of her own past, both the fact that she felt forced to kill her child and what it would mean to throw off the pain and the trauma of that, which for her is in some ways not possible. And so which is the power of the afterlife of, reproductive slavery, that she can't live that down. And so, I think what's salient, and perhaps what John is getting at here, is that, Setha not only has chosen to murder her child, but she begins to become so disturbed that at a certain point in her relationship with this ghost child, as it evolves, she imagines that the slave catchers are returning. And so when a white man, comes to her home, not to retrieve her child, but simply to, engage with her in an exchange about the property on which she's living, she, takes an ice pick and attacks him. And the community of women who has come up around her, Black women who are part of her world but have been very suspicious of her because of her violent actions in the past, they actually rise up in support of her, and in some ways, and in recognition of their relationship to her, because in some ways they realize that their reproductive lives were tainted by the same crucible of violence as Setha's own. And so they're able ultimately to create a sort of compassion there. But her actions represent a form of violent insurgency against the slave owner, both when she, imagines when she kills her child, but also when she reimagines that she's being sought out again. And I kind of try and underscore that to talk about the rock in a hard place into which the enslaved woman is put by this history of reproductive exploitation. So novels like Beloved become really important to my project because while they are based in real historical circumstances, they are in fact fictions. And in the way that they fictionalize the slave past through what the Black Studies scholar Sadia Hartman would call critical fabulation, they tell a truth about history that can't be told by the historian because of the paucity of the archive. That they tell us something really important about the afterlife of reproductive slavery and the position into which it puts women, which is that the only response for that many could imagine is violent protest, and that far from that being irrational, it is a very sensible response to the level of violence and destruction to which women are subjected.